The morning sun burned hot over St. George, Utah territory, painting the red sandstone cliffs in shades of crimson and gold. But Adelaide Carter saw none of it through her veil of tears as she stood alone at the altar of the modest wooden church, her white dress wilting in the August heat of 1878. The organ had fallen silent 20 minutes ago. The congregation had begun to whisper. And still Thomas had not arrived, would never arrive. She realized with dawning horror as his younger brother finally slipped through the side door and walked toward her with eyes full of pity, and a hastily scrawled note that explained nothing except that Thomas had taken the morning stage to California and wished her well in her future endeavors. The gasp that rose from the assembled crowd made Adelaide want to sink into the floorboards and disappear forever. She was 22 years old, alone in the world since her parents had died of fever the previous winter, and now publicly humiliated in front of everyone she knew in this small Mormon settlement that had barely tolerated her Presbyterian ways to begin with. Her hands shook as she clutched the note, the words swimming before her eyes, and she felt Mrs. Henderson's pitying hand on her shoulder, heard the woman's voice suggesting they go somewhere private, away from all these staring eyes. "I am sorry," Adelaide whispered, though she did not know what she was apologizing for, only that shame burned through her so intensely she thought she might combust right there in her wedding dress. "I should go." She turned and nearly ran down the aisle, her white skirts catching on the rough wooden pews as she fled. Her vision blurred with tears that she refused to let fall in front of these people who had never fully accepted her anyway. The August heat hit her like a physical blow when she burst through the church doors, and she stood there on the top step, gasping for air, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The small room she rented above the general store had already been given to someone else, her few possessions packed and loaded onto Thomas's wagon, which was nowhere to be seen because Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and Adelaide felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The church door opened behind her, and she braced herself for more pity, more awkward condolences, but instead she heard boot heels on the wooden steps and then a man's voice, deep and steady, saying words she would never forget. "I am here now." Adelaide turned, squinting against the sun, and saw a tall man she did not recognize standing 3 steps below her, his hat in his hands, his dark hair slightly mussed from where the hat had been. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with a weathered face that spoke of long days under the desert sun, dark eyes that held something she could not quite name, and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight she felt crushing her. "I beg your pardon," she managed, her voice hoarse. "Harrison Nash," he said, climbing the remaining steps until he stood beside her, close enough that she could see the dust on his boots, the calluses on his hands. "I own a cattle ranch about 15 miles north of here. I came to town for supplies and heard the commotion in the church. Seems to me a woman in a wedding dress ought to be getting married today." Adelaide stared at him, certain the heat had driven her mad. "Sir, I do not know you." "No, but I know enough," Harrison said quietly, glancing back at the church where faces were pressed against the windows, watching. "I know you are standing here alone when you should not be. I know this town will talk about this for months, and every day you stay here will be harder than the last. And I know I have been looking for a wife for 2 years now, but every woman in 3 counties wants nothing to do with a man whose ranch is that far from civilization." "You cannot be serious," Adelaide whispered, but something in his eyes told her he was entirely serious, impossibly serious, and her heart began to pound for reasons that had nothing to do with her earlier humiliation. "I have a preacher right inside that church, a congregation already assembled, and a woman in a wedding dress," Harrison said, and now there was the faintest hint of something warm in his voice, something that might have been humor under different circumstances. "Seems a shame to waste all that." "You do not know anything about me," Adelaide protested, but her voice lacked conviction because what choice did she have, really? She had $43 to her name, no family, no prospects, and a town full of people who would never let her forget this day. "I know you were willing to marry a man who did not deserve you," Harrison said, and his voice dropped lower, gentler. "I know you are brave enough to stand here and face this instead of hiding. That is more than enough for me. Why would you do this?" Adelaide asked, and she hated how her voice broke on the words. Harrison looked at her directly then, and she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. It was not pity, not charity, but something warmer and more complicated. "Because I have been alone too long," he said simply. "Because I think maybe you have too. Because sometimes the right thing happens in the strangest way, and a man has to be smart enough to recognize it when it does." Behind them, the church door opened again, and Reverend Palmer stuck his head out, his expression worried. "Miss Carter, are you all right?" Adelaide looked at the Reverend, then back at Harrison Nash, this stranger who was offering her a lifeline when she was drowning. She thought about her options, which were precisely none. She thought about the long, lonely months ahead if she stayed in St. George, about the whispers and the pitying looks. She thought about Thomas, who had promised her everything and left her with nothing but humiliation. And then she thought about the way Harrison was looking at her, like she was worth something, like this was not charity but rather an opportunity for both of them. "Reverend Palmer," she said, her voice stronger now, "would you be willing to perform a wedding ceremony?" The Reverend blinked in confusion. "But I thought—" "That is, Thomas is gone," Adelaide said firmly. "But Mr. Nash is here, and he has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted." The whispers that rose from inside the church were like a swarm of locusts, loud and overwhelming. But Harrison just held out his hand to her and said, "Shall we?" Adelaide placed her hand in his, felt the rough calluses and the solid warmth, and let him lead her back into the church she had fled just minutes before. The congregation was in an uproar, people standing and craning their necks to see Mrs. Henderson fanning herself dramatically as though she might faint. Harrison walked Adelaide back down the aisle with his head high, seemingly unbothered by the chaos, and when they reached the altar, he turned to face her and gave her the smallest, most encouraging smile. Reverend Palmer followed them, looking thoroughly bewildered but also intrigued by this turn of events. "Mr. Nash, I must ask if you are certain about this. You do not know Miss Carter?" "I am certain," Harrison said without hesitation. "Please proceed." The ceremony was a blur. Adelaide heard herself repeating vows she had practiced just that morning for a different man, felt Harrison slip a ring onto her finger that he pulled from his own pinky, heard him say, "I do," in a voice that resonated through the church. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison leaned down and pressed the briefest, gentlest kiss to her lips, and Adelaide felt something shift deep in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The congregation erupted into confused applause and scandalized whispers, and before Adelaide could fully process what had just happened, Harrison was guiding her back down the aisle, out of the church, and toward a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses that waited in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Your things?" he asked, all business now. "Thomas took them," Adelaide said numbly. "Everything except what I am wearing." Harrison's jaw tightened, the first sign of anger she had seen from him. "Then we will get you new things. For now, let us get out of here before that crowd decides to follow us and demand explanations." He helped her up into the wagon with hands that were gentle despite their strength, then swung up beside her and snapped the reins. The horses moved forward at a brisk pace, and Adelaide watched St. George fall away behind them, the red cliffs and the cluster of buildings growing smaller until they disappeared entirely. The road north was dusty and rough, winding through stands of juniper and sage, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Adelaide began to feel acutely aware of what she had just done. "I do not even know your full name," she said finally, her hands twisted in her lap. "Harrison Lee Nash," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. 30 years old, originally from Missouri, came west after the war. I have been running the Double N Ranch for 8 years now, running cattle mostly, some horses. I have a house, a barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and about 5,000 acres of the most beautiful and most stubborn land you will ever see." "How many ranch hands?" Adelaide asked, because it seemed important to know how many strangers she would be living among. "4 full-time, plus extra hands during roundup. Good men, all of them. They will be surprised to see me come home with a wife, but they will treat you with respect or answer to me." There was steel in his voice that made Adelaide believe him. "I should tell you about myself," Adelaide said quietly. "I am Adelaide Rose Carter, now Nash, I suppose. 22 years old, from Pennsylvania originally, though I have been in Utah Territory for 3 years. My parents came west looking for a new start, but they both died last winter. Thomas and I had been courting for 6 months, and I thought he was a good man." "He is a fool," Harrison said flatly. "Any man who would leave you at the altar is a fool. You do not know me well enough to say that. I know enough." Harrison glanced at her then, and Adelaide saw that warmth in his eyes again. "I know you did not fall apart back there, even though you had every right to. I know you were brave enough to take a chance on a stranger rather than accept pity and ruin. That tells me plenty." They rode in silence for a while longer, the sun climbing higher, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. Adelaide studied Harrison from the corner of her eye, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with easy confidence, the broad shoulders that strained slightly against his shirt. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, nothing like Thomas's softer, more refined features, and Adelaide found herself wondering what his life had been like, what had brought him to that church at exactly the right moment. "Why did you really do it?" she asked suddenly. "You could have any woman you wanted if you went to a bigger town, put out word that you were looking for a wife. Why me? Why like this?" Harrison was quiet for so long that Adelaide thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I saw you through the church window when I was loading supplies into the wagon. You were standing at the altar in that white dress, and the sun was coming through the stained glass, and you looked like something out of a painting. Then I saw your face when that boy came up to you with the note, saw the way you held yourself together even when you were breaking apart, and I thought, that is a woman worth knowing. That is a woman who will not crumble when things get hard. And things get hard on a ranch, Adelaide. Life is not easy out there." Adelaide's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "You know I might be terrible at being a rancher's wife." "You might be," Harrison agreed, "but you might be wonderful at it too. We will figure it out together." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the food Harrison had packed. Simple fare of bread and cheese and dried beef, washed down with water from a canteen that tasted faintly of metal. Adelaide sat in the shade of the wagon, her wedding dress already dusty and wrinkled, and tried to reconcile the morning she had planned with the reality she was living. She should have been married to Thomas by now, should have been settling into his house in town, should have been embarking on a life she had carefully planned and imagined. Instead, she was married to a stranger and heading toward a ranch she had never seen, And the strangest part was that she did not feel the crushing despair she had expected. She felt uncertain, yes, and frightened, but also something else. Something that might have been anticipation. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, watching Harrison check the horse's hooves with practiced ease. He glanced up at her, pleased by the question. "It is beautiful in a harsh way. The house sits in a valley with the mountains on one side and open rangeland on the other. There is a creek that runs year-round, enough water for the cattle and gardens if you want to plant them. The house is sturdy, built it myself with help from the hands. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen that needs a woman's touch, to be honest. It is not fancy, but it is solid and it is mine. Ours, I suppose. What do you do for supplies? You said it was 15 miles from town." "I make the trip once a month, more often if needed. We keep a good stock of staples, and there is plenty of game if we need fresh meat." "It can feel isolated sometimes, especially in winter, but I have always liked the solitude. I do not know if you will feel the same." Adelaide considered this. "I think I might. I never felt quite at home in St. George anyway. Too many people interested in everyone else's business." Harrison smiled, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look younger. "Then you will do fine." They reached the ranch as the sun was starting its descent, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Adelaide caught her breath at the sight. Harrison had not exaggerated. The house sat nestled against the hillside, built of rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a silver gray, with a wide porch and windows that caught the evening light. The barn was substantial, well-maintained, and beyond it she could see the bunkhouse and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, moving like slow clouds across the grassland, and the creek Harrison had mentioned glittered in the valley below. "It is beautiful," Adelaide said softly. Harrison pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, then reached up to help Adelaide. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. Then he released her and stepped back, his expression carefully neutral. "Let me show you inside," he said. The house was exactly as he had described it, solid and practical but undeniably masculine. The main room held a large fireplace, a worn sofa, a table with 4 chairs, and little else. The kitchen was functional but spare, and when Harrison showed her to the bedroom, Adelaide saw that it held only a large bed, a dresser, and a wardrobe. "I will sleep in the other room," Harrison said quickly, seeing her eyes widen. "Give you privacy until you are comfortable with things." "No pressure, Adelaide. We barely know each other." Adelaide felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. I appreciate that." They were interrupted by voices outside, and Harrison sighed. "The hands must have seen us arrive. Come on, let me introduce you." The 4 ranch hands were gathered on the porch, looking curious and surprised. Harrison introduced them quickly. Jacob, the foreman, a grizzled man in his 50s with kind eyes; Martin and Samuel, brothers in their 30s who had worked the ranch for 5 years; and young Danny, barely 20, who looked at Adelaide with undisguised wonder. "Boys, this is Adelaide, my wife," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of the boss but also a note of warning. "We were married today in St. George. I expect you to treat her with respect and help her settle in however she needs." The men exchanged glances, clearly bursting with questions, but Jacob just tipped his hat and said, "Welcome, Mrs. It will be nice to have a woman's presence on the ranch again." "Again?" Adelaide asked. "My mother lived here for a year before she decided ranch life was not for her," Harrison explained. "She moved to San Francisco to live with my sister. That was 3 years ago." After the hands returned to the bunkhouse, Harrison heated water so Adelaide could wash, then scrounged together a simple meal of beans and bacon and coffee. They ate in companionable silence at the kitchen table, both exhausted from the long, strange day. "I need to check on the cattle before dark," Harrison said, pushing back from the table. "Make yourself at home, Adelaide. Everything here is yours as much as mine now." After he left, Adelaide stood in the middle of the main room in her wrinkled wedding dress and tried to absorb the fact that this was her life now. She was married to a man she had met that morning. She was standing in a ranch house miles from the nearest town. Everything she had known was gone, replaced by something entirely unfamiliar. And yet, as she looked around the house, at the sturdy walls and the comfortable furniture and the view through the window of Harrison crossing the yard toward the barn, she did not feel the panic she expected. She felt tired, yes, and overwhelmed, but also strangely safe. She changed out of the wedding dress into the only other clothes she had, the simple day dress she had worn to the church that morning, which someone had kindly folded and left in the wagon. Then she began exploring the house more thoroughly, taking stock of what was there and what was needed. The kitchen had the basics, but lacked many staples. The main room was comfortable but impersonal. The bedroom Harrison had given her felt too large and too empty. When Harrison returned as the light was fading, he found her sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Cannot sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. "Too much to think about," Adelaide admitted. "Harrison, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you regret it, marrying me like that?" Harrison was quiet for a moment and Adelaide's heart sank, but then he said, "No, I do not regret it. Do you?" "I do not know yet," Adelaide said honestly. "Ask me again in a month." Harrison laughed, a low sound that rumbled in his chest. "Fair enough. Come on, you must be exhausted. Let me show you where the extra blankets are, and you can get some proper rest." That night, lying in the large bed that smelled of cedar and soap, Adelaide listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. She heard cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of wood as the house cooled, the whisper of wind through the juniper trees. And somewhere in the house, Harrison was lying awake too, this stranger who was now her husband, this man who had walked into a church and changed her life with 4 simple words: "I am here now." Adelaide closed her eyes and, against all odds, slept. The first weeks at the ranch passed in a blur of new routines and small discoveries. Adelaide rose early, unused to the demands of ranch life, but determined to prove she could handle it. She learned to cook for 6 men on the large wood stove, learned which supplies were kept where, learned the rhythm of the days that revolved around the cattle and the land. Harrison was patient with her, showing her how things worked without making her feel incompetent. He taught her to ride the gentle mare he had in the barn, explaining that she needed to be able to get to town on her own if necessary. He introduced her to the workings of the ranch, walking her around the property and explaining what needed to be done and when. And slowly, carefully, they began to know each other. Adelaide learned that Harrison woke before dawn every morning and liked his coffee strong and black. She learned that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a bullet wound during the war, that he loved this land with a fierce passion that sometimes surprised her with its intensity, and that he was kinder than he wanted people to know. She learned that he had a younger sister named Helen in San Francisco, that his parents were both dead, and that he had come west because he could not stand the memories of Missouri after the war. Harrison learned that Adelaide could not carry a tune to save her life, but hummed while she worked anyway. He learned that she was better educated than most women, that her father had believed in schooling for daughters as well as sons, and that she could discuss literature and history with an intelligence that impressed him. He learned that she had a quiet sense of humor, that she was stronger than she looked, and that she never complained, even when things were hard. They were polite to each other, respectful, friendly even, but there was a careful distance between them, an awareness that they were still essentially strangers who happened to share a house and a name. That began to change on a warm September evening when Adelaide was trying to move a heavy trunk in the bedroom, and Harrison heard the noise and came to help. They ended up sitting on the floor together, sorting through old linens and laughing over a badly embroidered pillowcase that Harrison's mother had made. She was terrible at needlework, Harrison said, holding up the crooked stitches. But she kept trying. Said a ranch wife needed to know these things. Did you miss her when she left? Adelaide asked. Yes and no, Harrison said honestly. She was not happy here. It was too lonely for her, too hard. She needed people and society and things I could not give her. I was sad to see her go, but I understood. This life is not for everyone. Do you worry I will leave too? Adelaide asked quietly. Harrison looked at her then, really looked at her, and Adelaide felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not anymore, he said. You are different from her. You do not complain about the isolation or the work. You seem almost at peace here. I am, Adelaide said, surprised to realize it was true. I never felt at peace in St. George. Always felt like I was trying to fit into a space that was not quite right. But here, I do not know, it feels different. It feels like I can breathe. I know what you mean, Harrison said. That is why I stayed even when it got hard. This place lets you breathe. Their eyes met and held, and something shifted in the air between them, something electric and charged. Harrison reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed her cheek, and Adelaide's breath caught. Adelaide, he said, his voice rough. I know this is not how either of us planned things, but I want you to know that I do not regret it, not for a single moment. You have brought something to this place, to my life, that I did not know was missing. What is that? Adelaide whispered. Light, Harrison said simply. You brought light. Adelaide did not know who moved first, but suddenly they were kissing, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent, more real. Harrison's hand cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone, and Adelaide felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. I do not want to push you, he said. I meant what I said about taking things slow. What if I do not want slow anymore? Adelaide asked, her heart pounding. What if I want this to be real? It is already real, Harrison said, his eyes searching hers. It has been real since the moment you took my hand in that church. That night, Adelaide did not sleep in the large bedroom alone. She slept in Harrison's arms in the smaller bedroom, and they made their marriage real in every sense of the word, learning each other with hands and whispers and a tenderness that took Adelaide's breath away. Harrison was gentle but passionate, patient but hungry, and Adelaide discovered that she was not the timid woman she had thought she was. She was brave and bold and wanting, and Harrison made her feel cherished in a way Thomas never had. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Harrison traced lazy patterns on her shoulder and said, I am falling in love with you, Adelaide Nash. I thought you should know. Adelaide's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst. I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. I did not think it was possible to feel this way about someone I barely knew a month ago. We know each other now, Harrison said, pulling her closer, and we have the rest of our lives to keep learning. The rest of September and all of October passed in a golden haze of happiness. Adelaide had never known that marriage could be like this, that love could be like this. Harrison was attentive and affectionate, stealing kisses when he came in from the range, holding her close at night, talking to her about his dreams for the ranch and asking about hers. They worked side by side, building a life together, and Adelaide felt herself transforming from the uncertain woman who had been abandoned at the altar into someone stronger, more confident, more herself. She also grew close to the ranch hands, especially Jacob, who reminded her of her father with his quiet wisdom and dry humor. The men seemed pleased to have her there, and she made sure they were well fed and tended to their needs when they were sick or injured. Danny developed an almost puppy-like devotion to her, and Adelaide found herself playing the role of older sister, offering advice and encouragement. In November, Harrison took her into St. George for supplies, and Adelaide faced the town that had seen her humiliation for the first time since her wedding day. She walked down the street with her head high and her hand in Harrison's, and she saw the surprise on people's faces when they realized she was not broken, not ruined, but rather glowing with happiness. Mrs. Henderson stopped them outside the general store, her eyes wide. "Adelaide Carter, I mean Nash, my goodness, we have been so worried about you." "No need to worry," Adelaide said pleasantly. "I am very well, as you can see. But to marry a stranger like that so impulsively, we all thought you must have been desperate." Harrison's hand tightened on Adelaide's, but his voice was calm when he said, "My wife was not desperate, madam. She was smart enough to recognize a good opportunity when she saw one. Same as I was." Adelaide smiled up at him, and the love between them was so obvious that Mrs. Henderson actually blushed and stammered an excuse to leave. "You did not have to defend me," Adelaide said as they continued down the street. "Yes, I did," Harrison said firmly. "You are my wife, and I will not have anyone suggesting you settled or that our marriage is anything less than what it is." "And what is it?" Adelaide teased. Harrison stopped right there in the middle of the street and kissed her thoroughly, not caring who saw. "It is the best decision I ever made," he said when he pulled back. "That is what it is." They loaded up the wagon with supplies, visited the land office where Harrison had business, and stopped at the hotel for a proper dinner, which felt impossibly luxurious after months of home cooking. On the way back to the ranch, with the wagon full and the sun setting behind them, Adelaide leaned against Harrison's shoulder and thought about how much her life had changed in just 3 months. "You ever think about Thomas?" Harrison asked suddenly. Adelaide considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only to think how lucky I am that he left. If he had gone through with the wedding, I would never have found you. I would be living a perfectly fine life with a perfectly fine man, and I would never have known what I was missing." "What would you be missing?" Harrison asked, though his smile suggested he knew the answer. "This," Adelaide said simply. "This life, this love, this feeling of being exactly where I am supposed to be. I would have missed all of it." Harrison kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Adelaide Nash." "I love you too, Harrison Nash." Winter came to the valley with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled high and temperatures that plummeted. The ranch work became harder, focused on keeping the cattle alive and the water sources from freezing. Adelaide learned to cope with the isolation, with days when they could not leave the house because of blizzards, with the constant cold that seeped through even the best chinked walls. But she also learned the beauty of winter evenings spent by the fire with Harrison, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about everything and nothing. She learned the comfort of lying wrapped in quilts with the man she loved while the wind howled outside. She learned that isolation was not the same as loneliness, not when you had the right person beside you. In January, Adelaide began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited another few weeks to be sure, then told Harrison one night as they were preparing for bed. "I think I am going to have a baby," she said, her voice shaking slightly with nerves and excitement. Harrison froze in the act of pulling off his boots. "Truly, truly. I am almost certain." Harrison was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Adelaide, that is wonderful. Are you happy?" "I am terrified," Adelaide admitted. "But yes, I am happy. Are you?" "I am the happiest man alive," Harrison said, pulling back to look at her face. "I am going to be a father. We are going to have a family." "We already are a family," Adelaide said, touching his cheek. "But yes, we are going to be a bigger one." The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide suffered from terrible sickness in the early months, could barely keep food down, and spent many mornings bent over a basin while Harrison held her hair back and murmured soothing words. But Harrison was endlessly patient, taking over many of her usual chores without complaint, making sure she rested, worrying over her in a way that was both sweet and slightly exasperating. "I am not made of glass," Adelaide protested one afternoon when Harrison tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "No, but you are carrying our child, and I will not have you overdo it," Harrison said firmly, taking the basket from her hands. As winter gave way to spring, Adelaide's sickness eased and her belly began to grow round with the baby. Harrison was fascinated by the changes in her body, often placing his hands on her stomach to feel the baby kick, his face full of wonder. "I cannot believe we made this," he said one evening, his hand spread across her belly. "A whole new person." "Technically, you did most of the work," Adelaide said, then laughed at Harrison's scandalized expression. "I am joking, mostly." "You are incorrigible," Harrison said, but he was smiling as he leaned down to kiss her stomach, then her lips. "I love you both so much." The baby came in late August, almost exactly a year after Adelaide and Harrison had married. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife Harrison had brought from St. George 2 weeks early, just to be safe. Adelaide labored through the night and into the next morning, with Harrison pacing outside the bedroom door and refusing to leave despite the midwife's insistence that he should go tend to ranch business. "I am not leaving," he said flatly. "That is my wife in there." When the baby finally arrived, a lusty boy with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs, the midwife allowed Harrison into the room. He took one look at Adelaide, exhausted and sweaty and glowing with joy, holding their son, and fell to his knees beside the bed. "You are amazing," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "He is perfect. You are perfect." "We need to name him," Adelaide said, her voice hoarse from screaming. They had discussed names for months but had never quite decided. Now, looking at his son, Harrison said, "Henry." "Henry James Nash, after your father and mine." "Henry," Adelaide repeated, testing it out. "Yes. Hello, Henry. Welcome to the world." The ranch hands were delighted with the new addition, taking turns bringing gifts and peering at the baby with awkward affection. Jacob carved a wooden horse, Martin and Samuel brought a cradle they had built in secret in the barn, and Danny looked at little Henry with such awe that Adelaide had to hide her smile. "He is so small," Danny said, as if this was a revelation. "Was I ever that small?" "You were," Jacob said dryly. "And you cried just as loud." Life with a newborn was exhausting but wonderful. Adelaide spent her days nursing Henry, changing him, marveling at every tiny expression and sound. Harrison was a devoted father, taking the baby when Adelaide needed rest, walking the floor with him at night when he fussed, and looking at his son with such pure love that it made Adelaide's heart ache. "I never knew I could feel like this," Harrison said one night, holding Henry against his shoulder while Adelaide tried to eat dinner with both hands for once. Like my heart is walking around outside my body. That is exactly what it is like, Adelaide agreed. Terrifying and wonderful all at once. As Henry grew from a newborn into an infant and then a toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Harrison expanded the herd, bought more land, and built a new barn. Adelaide planted a garden that flourished in the valley soil, kept the house running smoothly, and discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch finances that Harrison gratefully turned over to her. They celebrated their second anniversary with a quiet dinner after Henry was asleep, reflecting on how much had changed since that shocking day in the church. "You remember what you said when you first walked up to me?" Adelaide asked, her hand in Harrison's as they sat on the porch watching the stars. "I said I am here now," Harrison recalled. "And I meant it. I am here, Adelaide. I will always be here." "I know," Adelaide said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "That is the most wonderful thing about you. You say what you mean, and you mean what you say. No false promises, no running away when things get hard." "I could never run away from you," Harrison said seriously. "You are everything to me. You and Henry, you are my whole world." Life continued its steady rhythm through the seasons and years. Henry grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere, absorbing knowledge about cattle and horses, and the land with an eagerness that made Harrison glow with pride. When Henry was 3, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again, and 9 months later delivered a daughter they named Alice Marie, after Harrison's sister and Adelaide's mother. Alice was different from Henry, quieter and more observant, with her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She was content to sit and watch the world around her, and as she grew, she developed a love for books and learning that reminded Harrison of Adelaide. When Henry was 7 and Alice was 4, Adelaide became pregnant once more, and this time delivered twins, boys they named Owen and Emmett. The house that had once seemed too large and too quiet was now full to bursting with noise and laughter, and the controlled chaos of 4 young children. Harrison added onto the house, building a new wing with 2 more bedrooms and a larger main room where the family could gather. The ranch continued to prosper, earning a reputation for quality cattle and honest dealing. Harrison trained Henry to take over the ranch someday, teaching him everything he knew, while Adelaide taught all the children to read and write and figure, determined they would have every advantage education could provide. The years were not always easy. There were droughts that tested them, harsh winters that took a toll on the herd, injuries and illnesses that frightened them. When Henry was 11, he was thrown from a horse and broke his arm badly, and Harrison and Adelaide spent 3 sleepless nights waiting to see if infection would set in. When Alice was 8, she developed a terrible fever that had Adelaide sleeping on the floor beside her bed for a week, refusing to leave her side. But through all of it, Harrison and Adelaide faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each challenge they overcame. They had built something real and lasting, a partnership based on love and respect and the kind of deep knowing that came from years of working side by side. On their 10th anniversary, Harrison surprised Adelaide with a trip to San Francisco to visit his sister Helen. They left the children with Jacob and the ranch hands, who had long since become family, and spent 2 weeks in the city, staying in a hotel and seeing sights Adelaide had only read about. Helen adored Adelaide, and the 2 women became fast friends, talking late into the night while Harrison and Helen's husband discussed business and politics. But despite the excitement of the city, Adelaide found herself missing the ranch, missing the wide open spaces and the quiet and the feeling of home. "Are you ready to go back?" Harrison asked on their last evening as they walked along the waterfront. "I am," Adelaide admitted. Is that strange? This place is beautiful, but it is not ours. It is not strange at all, Harrison said, pulling her close. I feel the same way. The ranch is our place. It is where we belong. They returned home to a joyous reunion with their children, and Adelaide realized as she walked through the door that she had never been happier. The house was messy and loud and full of life, and it was exactly what she had never known she wanted. The children grew. Henry became a young man who looked so much like his father, it sometimes took Adelaide's breath away. But he had inherited her thoughtfulness and her love of reading, making him a unique combination of both parents. He courted and married a rancher's daughter from a nearby property, and Harrison gave them land to start their own herd, pleased to see his son building a life in the valley they loved. Alice proved to be brilliant, devouring every book Adelaide could find for her. She wanted to be a teacher, and Adelaide and Harrison sent her to a school in Salt Lake City, proud and terrified in equal measure to see her off on such an adventure. Alice returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate and immediately opened a small school on the ranch for the children of the area, including her younger brothers. Owen and Emmett were inseparable, running wild on the ranch and giving their parents more gray hairs than they cared to count. They were bright and bold and utterly fearless, and Adelaide often found herself torn between pride in their spirit and terror at their antics. Years passed in the way they do, marked by birthdays and holidays and the rhythms of ranch life. Adelaide's hair gained threads of silver. Harrison's face gained new lines, but the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable, the foundation on which everything else in their lives was built. They danced in the kitchen when no one was watching, still stole kisses when they passed each other in the hall, still lay awake at night talking about their dreams and their memories and their gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about that day?" Harrison asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley they had built their life in. They were in their 50s now, with grandchildren playing in the yard and decades of shared history behind them. "Every day," Adelaide said honestly. "I think about standing in that church in my wedding dress, feeling like my life was over. And then I think about you walking in and saying you were here now and how everything changed in that moment." "I saw you through that window and I knew," Harrison said quietly. "I knew you were supposed to be mine. I cannot explain it, but I knew." "You saved me that day," Adelaide said, her hand finding his. "No," Harrison said firmly, bringing her hand to his lips. "We saved each other. You gave me a reason to build something bigger than just a successful ranch. You gave me a family, a home, a life worth living. We were both alone, Adelaide, and then we were not." Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their grandchildren play, listening to the sounds of dinner being prepared inside where Alice was cooking, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you, Harrison Nash," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them decades ago. "I love you too, Adelaide Nash," Harrison replied, "from that moment in the church until forever." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, Adelaide reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been abandoned at the altar, humiliated and lost, and Harrison had walked into that church and offered her not just rescue, but a future beyond anything she could have imagined. They had built a life together on this ranch, raised 4 children who were now adults building their own lives, created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. They had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and through it all, Their love had been the constant, the thing that never wavered. Adelaide thought about Thomas sometimes, the man who had abandoned her, and she felt nothing but gratitude. His cowardice had led her to Harrison's courage. His weakness had led her to Harrison's strength. His absence had led her to Harrison's presence. The children and grandchildren called them in for dinner, and Harrison helped Adelaide to her feet with the gallantry he had always shown her. They walked inside together, hand in hand, into the warm light and noise of their family. This beautiful life they had created from the ashes of Adelaide's worst day. And Adelaide knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that every moment of pain and uncertainty had been worth it to arrive at this place, with this man, surrounded by this love. She had been abandoned at the church, but Harrison had walked in and said he was there now. And he had been. For 35 years, through everything life had thrown at them, Harrison had been there. And as they sat down to dinner surrounded by their children and grandchildren, the house full of laughter and love and the rich history of a life well lived, Adelaide sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the stranger who had become her husband, her partner, her greatest love. Harrison caught her eye across the table and smiled, that same warm smile that had reassured her on their wedding day, and Adelaide smiled back, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. They had the rest of their years together still ahead of them, more grandchildren to welcome, more memories to make, more quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. They would grow old together on this ranch they loved, and someday they would be buried together in the small cemetery on the hillside. Their stories passed down through generations as an example of how love could bloom in the most unexpected places, how courage could change everything, how 4 simple words could alter the course of 2 lives forever. I am here now, and Harrison had been. He had been there when Adelaide needed him most, and he had stayed, and together they had created something beautiful and lasting and true. As the evening wore on and the grandchildren were put to bed, and the adult children said their goodbyes, Harrison and Adelaide found themselves alone once more, sitting by the fireplace in the room they had shared for over 3 decades. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, seeing the contemplative expression on Adelaide's face. "About how grateful I am," Adelaide said simply, "for all of this, for you, for the life we have built. I never imagined I could be this happy, Harrison. That day in the church I thought my life was ruined. I thought I would never recover from the humiliation, never find love, never have a family. And now look at us." Harrison pulled her close and Adelaide settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I am grateful too," he said. "Every single day, I wake up grateful that I decided to go into town that day, that I looked through that church window, that I was brave enough to walk in and offer you my hand. Best decision I ever made. Best decision I ever made was taking it," Adelaide said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low until Harrison spoke again. "Adelaide, I want you to know something. If I had 100 lifetimes, I would choose you in every single one. I would walk into that church 100 times and say those same words, because you are everything I never knew I needed." Adelaide lifted her head to look at him, this man who had been her rock, her partner, her love for so many years. His hair was gray now, his face weathered by years of sun and wind, but his eyes held the same warmth and steadiness that had captured her heart all those years ago. "I would choose you too," she said. "In every lifetime, in every version of our story, I would choose you." Harrison kissed her then, tender and sweet, a kiss that spoke of decades of love and devotion and the bone-deep knowledge that they belonged together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Harrison said, standing and offering Adelaide his hand just as he had on their wedding day. "Let us go to bed, Mrs. Nash. We have another beautiful day ahead of us tomorrow." Adelaide took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. "Indeed we do, Mr. Nash, indeed we do." They walked to their bedroom together, hands entwined, and Adelaide thought about how this simple gesture, this holding of hands, had been a constant throughout their marriage. From that first moment on the church steps to this moment now, Harrison had always offered his hand, and Adelaide had always taken it, and together they had walked through life side by side. As they settled into bed, Harrison pulled Adelaide close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "I love you," Harrison murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Adelaide whispered back. And as they drifted off to sleep, Adelaide's last thought was one of profound gratitude. She had been abandoned at the church, lost and alone, but Harrison had walked in and changed everything with 4 simple words. He had been there that day, and he had been there every day since, and Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that he would be there for every day they had left. Their story, which had begun in heartbreak and humiliation, had become something beautiful and enduring. It was a story of courage and chance, of love found in unexpected places, of 2 people who had taken a leap of faith and built a life that exceeded all their dreams. The ranch would continue for generations, the double and a testament to what Harrison and Adelaide had created together. Their children would tell their story to their grandchildren, who would tell it to their children, and on, the tale of how a rancher walked into a church and saved a woman in a wedding dress, and how that woman saved him right back. In the morning, they would wake wrapped in each other's arms and face another day together. There would be breakfast to make and ranch work to oversee and grandchildren to spoil. There would be laughter and challenges and all the small moments that made up a life well lived. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Harrison and Adelaide simply held each other close, 2 hearts beating in sync, 2 lives so thoroughly entwined they could no longer remember where one ended and the other began. They had found each other on the worst day of Adelaide's life, and from that moment forward, every day had been better than the last. Not easier, necessarily, but better, because they were together. And as the moon rose over the valley and cast silver light through their bedroom window, Adelaide Nash closed her eyes and smiled, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she belonged with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The story that began with 4 words and a leap of faith had become a lifetime of love, and Adelaide would not have changed a single moment of it. Not the fear or the uncertainty or the challenges they had faced, because all of it had led to this, to the beautiful life they had created together. Harrison's arms tightened around her in his sleep, and Adelaide's smile deepened. Yes, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, this was exactly how the story was supposed to go. She had been abandoned at the church, but Harrison had walked in and said he was there now, and he had been and he always would be for as long as they both lived. And that was everything. That was more than enough. That was perfect, the end.